Welcome to Sab's podcast. I'm your host, sabrinasalvati. My special guest today is Professor David Miller. He recently had his case dismissed from the University of Bristol for allegations of anti-Semitism, and he just won the case against him. Welcome, David. Thank you so much for coming on.
It's a pleasure.
So, David, it was great news to hear a couple weeks ago that the Employment Tribunal dismissed this case against you. I want to start from the beginning for people who may not be aware of all the details. I know you had allegations of anti-Semitism brought against you from the University of Bristol. Let's start there. Like, how did those allegations begin? And then walk us through the timeline up until today.
Okay, so I mean, I can tell you this in the long way or the short way. I'll try the short way. So it started in 2019 when I just started working at the University of Bristol. I did a lecture on Islamophobia where I discussed my theory about the factors leading to and the promotion of Islamophobia, which includes the role of the Zionist movement in promoting anti-Muslim hatred. A couple of students complained, an Israel lobby group took the complaint. It was rejected. The Israel lobby group then approached the Zionist student organization, the Union of Jewish Students, who took a complaint, and it was accepted because the president of the local affiliate, the Bristol Jewish Society, was a student at the time, although she'd never been my student, never attended any of my classes, never spoken to anyone that's ever been to my classes, and they took a complaint. And there's a long process that went on then, but eventually what happened was, first of all, the university declared that I wasn't anti-Semitic. The student appealed, and then another year passed, and an external QC, that's an external lawyer, was appointed by the university, who determined that there wasn't anything I'd ever said, including going back to 2012 and 13, which was in any way anti-Semitic. I was cleared by the university, and this is in December 2020. And then 6 weeks later, I went on a public meeting and I discussed my case. I said, and these are the words which led to the sacking eventually. I said, I have been attacked and complained about by these two Zionist student organizations. And then all hell broke loose. 100 members of the Houses of Lords and Commons wrote for me to be sacked. Zionist professors in my university asked for me to be sacked. Funding agencies, which were Zionist funding bodies, asked for me to be sacked. And there was a huge campaign. They had another investigation. I was again found not guilty of anti-Semitism, but nevertheless, they sacked me because they said that I had not met the standards expected of a professor, by which they meant that some students who had heard my anti-Zionist views, who were Zionists, had been upset by my comments, and that was it. And so there we went through an appeal process which they rejected, and then finally, in October last year, we went to an employment tribunal. I took the university to court, and that's the process which has just concluded with me winning hands down on all counts in a pretty dramatic victory, I think.
It's interesting that you mentioned that the Israeli lobby actually approached those students, because I know at least in our country, in the U.S., they are very heavily involved with U.S. politics. They're very much involved with our Congress. So a lot of the Congress members have taken some type of donations from the Israeli lobby. So they're very much embedded in the political process in this country. But this was the first time that I heard they actually approached students at a university. And so this is one of my big concerns. A lot of these, the Israeli lobby is very powerful. And I don't think a lot of people realize just how much power they actually have, not just in the political space, but also in academia. I'm sure you heard about the former president of Harvard University, Claudine Gray. You know, they came after her. And even though the university supported Claudine, she ultimately decided to resign because of the pressure that was brought against her. And, you know, of course, they brought the plagiarism accusations against her as well. But it's really scary to me, because I feel like this is a free speech issue. And so when I heard about you winning your case, I was like, this is a plus, because I think this is the first case that I've heard of, at least particularly in the West, that's been won against this type of allegation. How do you feel about the fact that the Israeli lobby can be that powerful to the point where they can actually get involved in the university process as well?
Well, I mean, there have been very many cases, and of course, the cases have skyrocketed since the beginning of the genocide in Gaza. And what they're trying to do, of course, is to make sure that there is nobody who has a public platform in academia or indeed in journalism or anywhere else who can support the rights of the Palestinians. And so they go after everybody. And they have lots of successes. They were successful in having me sacked. And of course, Claudine, as you say, another example, many other examples in the US and in the UK and indeed in other places like Germany. So yes, this is an indication of the power that they have, and yes, they've had many successes, and they will continue to have successes. This is an ongoing process. But the other thing I would say about this, though, is that they are on the back foot more generally, which is that everybody now in the world sees the genocide in Gaza. I think prior to October the 7th, there were many millions of people who weren't convinced by the kinds of things that I've been saying and many others have been saying for many years, which is that Zionism is racism. Zionism is an inherently genocidal ideology. They committed a genocide in the Nakba in 1948 when they displaced 750,000 Palestinians and killed many more. And they're committing a genocide now. This is what Zionism is. And many millions of people now see that. And that genie cannot be put back into its bottle. And as a result, they're under significant pressure. I would just give one example, as many examples I could give. The case of Elon Musk, who takes over Twitter and this free speech crusade almost, and then goes to Israel, meets Benjamin Netanyahu, and then hangs out with Ben Shapiro and many others. And then what happens is that he says, "Oh, well, look, the slogan from the river to the sea is genocidal. This is anti-Jewish, and it calls for the destruction of the Jewish people." Of course, it doesn't do anything of the sort, and therefore it's not going to be allowed on X anymore. And what happened as a result? Was anybody removed from X as a result of that? As far as I'm aware, not a single person. And the reason is because the use of the hashtag skyrocketed after he'd said that, and because there are so many millions of people around the world who support the Palestinians, it's not possible for them to remove pro-Palestinian comment and content. And that's the case on X, but it's also the case even on much more obviously Zionist organizations like Meta, which runs across Facebook and Instagram. They can't remove the pro-Palestinian content because it's so overwhelmingly pro-Palestine all over the world. So I think that this is a long way around to saying they're on the back foot and we are winning. Doesn't mean they won't have many more victories on the way, but we are winning this, and that's in my case. I think I think and believe is an example of that, and the specific findings in my case I think will act as a precedent for defending anti-Zionist views in the months and years ahead.
And one of the things that the tribunal ruled is that you were actually discriminated against because having anti-Zionist rules actually is protected under free speech, because anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism. I'm sure you may have heard about this, but in the US, our Congress they were moving forward with legislation to actually label anti-Zionism as anti-Semitism. And this is a very scary time, obviously, because we know those are not the same thing. But there was a lot of pushback from the American people in reference to that as well. What do you feel, or how would you explain to people the difference between the two? Because I think a lot of people, or some people, are still confused. They think that if you say, it's wrong to be a Zionist, some people assume that you're being anti-Semitic. And how do you feel that narrative even started in the first place?
Well, I mean, the case that I put it in the tribunal was that I defined Zionism as being an ideology which looks forward to the creation of a Jewish state in the historic territory of Palestine. And that's a pretty neutral definition, which Zionists don't really demur from. And of course, the difficulty with that in terms of Jewish self-determination, which is how they would see it, is that, of course, there was another people there already, the indigenous people of Palestine, the Palestinians. And you can't establish a Jewish state which excludes the Palestinians in that territory without it being fundamentally racist. And that's why we say Zionism is racist. Now, where did it come from? Well, it came from the Israeli government. The process started way back before the 1970s, but the place it's almost mostly regarded as starting is with Abe Ban, the Israeli foreign minister, who in 1972, in a speech in the US, actually declared that anti-Zionism is the new anti-Semitism. So no longer would we think about anti-Semitism as being a form of racism against the Jews. We would think of it simply as those people who object to the settler colonial nature and the racist nature of the state of Israel. So that's where it comes from. And of course, there's been a long process over 50 years to attach that to an institution. First of all, the Israeli government managed to attach it to a European Union body, which is now called the Fundamental Rights Agency, which eventually dropped it. And then in around 2013, at the Global Forum for Combating Anti-Semitism, an Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs body, they were panicking because they had nowhere to attach it to. And so they found a new place to attach it to. And that place, of course, was the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. And that, of course, is a body set up by the Israelis and which has as national members states which are allies of Israel. And so that was the weapon which they've used, the weapon of choice to take on the Palestinian movement. And of course, the weapon can't be used without having people to use it. So they have to multiply pro-Israel groups in the US and the UK and everywhere else from around 2014 onwards, so that they can use this weapon to beat the Palestinian movement. Of course, that's what you've seen in Congress, and that's what we've seen in the UK. The University of Bristol, of course, had adopted the IHRA, and they then examined my comments in relation to it. And still, of course, they found that there was no sign of me even breaching the IHRA, never mind anything else. And of course, let's remember, just to conclude, that the IHRA has appended to it several examples, most of which are to do with Israel, not to do, in fact, with racism against the Jews at all. So this is an Israel lobby instrument.
Yeah, that's right. Barry Weiss, journalist Barry Weiss, she was one of the people that actually was trying to push this dismissal of your position here. Actually, Z Squirrel had shared this a while back, said Barry Weiss, who murdered Rafid al-Arir by putting a kill target on him in an active genocide zone, made herself very rich pretending to love free speech, as she kept demanding the firing of anyone critical of Israel like David Miller. And here's an example here where there was a tweet shared from Barry Weiss where it said, tomorrow night, 9:30 p.m., join Clubhouse with the real leaders of the Jewish community if you don't yet know the names. And she mentions Isaac DeCastrog, Blake Flayton, Sabry's son Miller, Max Price, Rose Rich. You should. And he goes on to say solidarity with all Jewish students at Bristol University, especially the very clever Sabry son Miller. So that is her sharing this tweet here from Stand With Us. Watch anti-Semitism crisis at Bristol University. We speak to one of the students calling out anti-Semitism on campus. So she is one of the voices that has been heavily critical of people who are anti-Zionists, not just anti-Semitic, but also anti-Zionist, and people that are actually in support of Palestinian self-determination. How do you feel about the fact that someone like Barry Weiss, with the platform that she has as a journalist, can have that type of power as well?
Well, it's not just Barry Weiss, is it? I mean, it's a whole interlocking network. So Barry Weiss is effectively an agent or an asset of the state of Israel, as is Ben Shapiro and many of the other people who your viewers would know about in the US. But these are people who are, of course, locked into Ministry of Foreign Affairs WhatsApp groups and talking points, and they promote them internationally. Now, in my case, there were 4 particular students who were Zionist students, part of the Zionist student organization, who made all sorts of comments about me. That the particular person you're talking about there, Sabrina Miller, who now, of course, has been promoted to working on the right-wing conservative tabloid, the Daily Mail, she actually tried to infiltrate one of my classes. She was never a student of mine. She did an art subject. I'm a social scientist. She tried to come into my class, and she looked so crazy in the class that I spotted that she wasn't one of my students, and I told her to leave. But that's the kind of tactics that they use to try and find ways to undermine those of us on campus who are anti-Zionists. And of course, they try and pretend that really we hate the Jews. And and it's a nonsense. But that they've got such an organizational heft behind them that they're able to promote this stuff, and then they get supported by Weiss or Ben Shapiro, or or the apps that are designed by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which promote messaging on Facebook and on Twitter and on the social media. So messages come out from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and then there are hundreds of people around the world who repeat those messages and then call on politicians and others to isolate the person who has done the latest bad thing according to them. So this is a network. We shouldn't see this as just individuals who have bad ideas. It's a network, and they are connected to each other, and they promote each other.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, because I do notice they tend to retweet each other and et cetera. And one person will tweet something, and then the next person will tweet a tweet that's very similar to that in reference to Israel. How would you describe the pro-Palestine movement in the UK? Like, how do people feel there in reference to what's happening to Palestinians in Gaza?
Well, there's been a tremendous outpouring of horror. No one can watch these. No one who's sentient or human can watch the bodies of children, of babies being recovered from wreckage. The footage from hospitals, children being amputated, having limbs amputated with no anesthetic. No one can watch these things and not be horrified by them. And of course, many millions of people in this country are horrified, and there have been hundreds of thousands of people on the streets in London and in every city around the country demonstrating against this. So there's a massive feeling in the country about this. But of course, the government, meaning the ruling Conservative Party, and indeed, of course, the main opposition, are 100% in the Zionist camp. So there's a difficulty, there's a disconnect in our country between popular views and how they're expressed in politics. I understand that's the same in the US, and so yeah. That's a problem. But the demonstrations have been like the demonstrations against the Iraq War in 2003, massive demonstrations, and of course the government tries to ignore that, but it's having its own pressure, and we can see that pressure operating in the sense both of the various judgments that have been made in various countries, European countries, the court judgment in Belgium just the other day to stop F-35 fighter jet parts going to Israel, but also, of course, the sense that people have in this country that American power in the world is on the decline. And so I think that's a very interesting element of what's happening. We didn't have that sense on Iraq. We saw, of course, the shock and awe as they launched the invasion in February or March 2003, but we don't have that sense now, because of course the sense of American power as being on the decline is very widespread, and I think that's an indication that this is very difficult for the Zionists, because once their main sponsor is not able to project power in the way that it once was, it makes it very difficult for them to win in this circumstance, and I think that's why they're going to lose in the end.
Well said. We also didn't have social media in 2003 either. So no Facebook and no Twitter. And, I've seen so many images coming out of Gaza from journalists that are there on the ground all across the board. And even people who I'm friends with that don't usually pay attention to politics per se, they've even seen the images and they said this is absolutely ridiculous. I want to go back to your situation at the university. So what happens now? Are you going to be reinstated at the University of Bristol? And do you want to return back to that institution?
So, I mean, maybe I need to explain, in terms of the judgment, what the judgment was in order to answer that question. So, first of all, there was two major ways in which we won the case. The first way, which of course was important for me and cleared my name, was that it was determined that the university had wrongly dismissed me, that they had not properly investigated, they had not listened to any of the evidence I submitted, they hadn't properly cross-examined the students who complained, and they hadn't properly evaluated the different options when the investigation was done. So that I was cleared. The court declared I'd been wrongly dismissed, and I'll be getting compensation for that. But the other thing that the court declared, and you mentioned this a little while ago, was that that my view, that the reason I was dismissed was because of my views. It wasn't because I'd upset the students. That's what the university said was the reason. But under cross-examination, the university's own witnesses admitted that actually it was because I had anti-Zionist views. That was the reason I was actually dismissed. And that finding led to the court declaring that anti-Zionist views of the sort which I had espoused and set out in my submission statements were worthy of respect in a democratic society. That's the technical language from the Equality Act, and therefore qualify as a philosophical belief, a sufficient level of coherence and cogency to be a philosophical belief, which means that under the law, I cannot be, and no one else can from now on, be discriminated against on the basis of having anti-Zionist views. So that's a legal principle now established in law in the UK, which of course drives a coach and horses through the IHRA and through all the Israeli talking points on this matter. What's going to happen now is that the court has to meet again to determine how much compensation I will get, and then also whether it's the case that I should be given my job back. I don't know what will happen if that's the case, if the university would accede to that. If they refuse, then I would have to take them to court again, I think, is my understanding, to get further compensation. But we'll see what happens with that. I would like my job back, but I would also say, and I've said this to a number of people, that look, since I've been sacked, I was in academia for more than 3 decades, teaching, doing administration, getting research grants, publications, and when in a neoliberal university, which all of our universities now are, the space for research over the 30 years I was an academic constrained, so you had much less time for research and had to do more teaching and more administration. But since I've been sacked, I've had much more time to focus on research on the Zionist movement. Right, so I mean, I present a program. I'm the producer and the resident expert of a show called Palestine Declassified, a weekly half-hour show on Palestine. And the amount of research and writing and publications that I've done in relation to Zionism and the question of Palestine far exceed anything I've done in the previous, 5 to 10 years, because I've had much more time to do so. So in a way, I've said this a couple of times. In a way, I'm sort of thankful to the Zionists for allowing me to spend so much more time attacking them and understanding them than I'd previously been allowed. So I've enjoyed the last 2 years. Yes, I've been sacked. Yes, it's been challenging, but I've enjoyed the ability and the freedom to investigate Zionism in a way which I never had the opportunity to do before. So there are silver linings in every cloud.
So, David, have you received any type of threats since you've been dismissed from the university?
Well, I mean, I regularly get veiled threats on X, Twitter. I did a public talk at the weekend just there locally in Bristol, a massively attended, packed out meeting with many people from Gaza who've lost family or who are living in daily fear of their family being killed by the Zionists. And of course, so what happened outside was that 40 or so students of 18 and 19 years old came and chanted outside the community centre where I was talking, Miller, Miller, shame on you, which was a bit of an embarrassment for them, especially given the community centre is called the Malcolm X Community Centre. It's a kind of iconic building in Bristol in the anti-racist movement. So they were trying to intimidate the people coming to the meeting, of course, and it's disgraceful that they would do that. But I haven't had significant and serious threats of violence, but I have had veiled threats, and that's what you live with.
How do you feel about the ruling that came down from the ICJ? South Africa took Israel to court at the ICJ, and they ruled that basically, Israel has to do everything that it can to prevent a genocide. Obviously, Israel has still been attacking refugee camps since that ruling has happened. How do you feel about that ruling, and do you feel like that went far enough?
Well, obviously, it didn't go far enough, but it's. I hate to say it, given the sheer number of deaths and war crimes which are committed every day. But it's part of a process, and of course the South African government is going back to the ICJ, and let's see how far this goes. I mean, we have to push it as far as we can. These people have to be arraigned in The Hague. We have to have gallant and Netanyahu and Herzog and Ben-Gvir and Smotrich and all of them paraded before the Hague in a kind of latter-day Nuremberg tribunal. I mean, let's remember back then it was von Ribbentrop and Hess and Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe, who were arraigned there at the tribunal. So that's one part of it. But of course, there's another part, which is that what the Allies, meaning of course the US, France, Britain, and the Soviet Union, decided and agreed in 1945 at Yalta, was a process of denazification. And that's the process which we have to move on in the coming months, so that we move to de-Zionize the society. There were millions and millions of people who joined Nazi organizations in Germany, and there are millions and millions of people who have joined genocidal Zionist organizations in Israel, and they need to be de-Zionized. And that means, of course, some kind of process of re-education, of reintegrating them into a society so that they can actually live with people who are not Jewish. I mean, it's a tricky process, but that has to be part of the process. And I would say that really we have to move to de-Zionization, not just in Palestine, but in the US, in the UK, and in everywhere where there is an organized and active Zionist movement. And that's about 35 countries around the world. And that's a tremendously difficult process, but we can see the seeds and the beginning of that already in the various court cases which have been taken in France, for example, in Belgium, in the UK, and elsewhere, and in South Africa too, against citizens of those countries who have gone to fight in Palestine, who've gone to commit genocide and war crimes with the IDF. Now that's a process which has to be properly followed through. The governments in all of these countries, with the exception of South Africa, are not properly dealing with that, but there are legal cases ongoing, and we know, as people who are on social media, there are many people from the UK who've gone and engaged in war crimes there. We don't have the names of all these people yet, but as the names are accumulated, these people need to be taken to court and held accountable for the crimes. And that's what I would hope is the process from here, which also involves the ICJ process and pushing that as far as it can go.
Before that, before the ICJ trial, there was actually a hearing with the UN Security Council whether or not to vote for a ceasefire. And every country that was there voted in favor of a ceasefire, except for the United States. I think a lot of people remember the United States voted against it. And what was odd is that the UK chose to abstain. And I wanted to get your take on this. Why do you think the UK chose to abstain?
Well, there's a sort of embarrassment, isn't there? I mean, the UK is trying to present itself as doing some positive things. So it's for the first time said that it will recognize a Palestinian state in the future. The Foreign Secretary, who's the previous Prime Minister, David Cameron, has also said that violent settlers who come back to the UK will be arrested and held accountable. So far as we know, nobody has been held accountable or arrested for that, and it's not clear what a violent settler would be. I mean, all the settlers who are there have expropriated land and stolen land and ethnically cleansed the Palestinians. So that in itself presumably means that any settler should be arrested. But there's been no movement on the question of IDF people who have committed war crimes. We know that some of them are back in the UK, and there's been no movement on that. But I guess this part of a wider calculus. So, I mean, the negotiations that are ongoing between the Palestinian resistance, which are being mediated by Qatar and indeed by Egypt, those are negotiations which will include some representatives from the UK. So I imagine there's something happening there, which they're trying to engage in a way which makes them seem better than they actually are. But at the same time, of course, we know that there have been spy flights from the British bases in Cyprus overflying Gaza, and we know that there are Israeli soldiers currently being trained in the UK. So the UK's position is more or less similar to the US's, really.
That's interesting. That was the first Israeli soldiers being trained in the UK. It's interesting because in the United States, we have US police officers that are actually trained by the IDF. So it's interesting to see that overlap.
Well, that's right. I mean, I remember when after George Floyd died, there was a big thing about whether the knee on the neck technique had been taught by these counterterrorism seminars, which for example, the Anti-Defamation League runs, but it's not only the ADL which runs these. And there was a dispute about that. And of course, the Israelis denied it. I mean, I later did some research on this where I showed that actually it was worse than that. That these seminars, yes, of course, they were training US cops, but that actually the four cops who were involved in killing George Floyd, that three of them at least had been trained at a local college in this Israeli martial arts technique, Krav Maga, by Israeli trained Krav Maga trainers. So they had learned the technique in the official training of the Minnesota police. And so it was kind of, in a way, it was much more embedded in the processes of the Minnesota police than perhaps people realized. It wasn't just that they got these seminars and talked a little bit about the awful Palestinians. It was that they actually had direct training in the near neck technique from the local provider of police training, paid for by Minnesota and local government. So yeah, I mean, this is an integration of Zionist techniques into the very fabric of law enforcement in the US. And as you've been saying, the Zionists are integrated and embedded throughout US society, as they are indeed in the UK, and people are just beginning to wake up to that.
All right, David, where can people find your work?
So I'm on X at tracking_power. I run a website called Spinwatch, which examines spin and propaganda, and a website called powerbase.info, which is a kind of wiki site which tracks power networks. So that's the places that they can see my work. And I would say, lastly, the thing to say is I've had to raise more than over £100,000 of legal costs. We're currently at about £100,000. We need a bit more. If people can donate, then any small amount is very, very welcome. We have a few £1,000s still to raise, and they can donate at fightingfund.org. So that's what I would say.
All right, David Miller, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.